Today at Petrochemical Strategies, Joint Ventures Part 2. Today I'll be talking about joint ventures with Peter Daniel. He is the Senior Managing Director at Water Street Partners, an Ankura Company. It's the 25th day of August in the year 2020. Last week I told a tragic love story about a fictional joint venture between Pat and Chris. That joint venture didn't turn out so well, but that's not the case for all joint ventures. If you haven't seen the video, I'd suggest watching it before you watch today's episode. The petrochemicals industry in North America has a whole bunch of joint ventures. Let's talk a little bit about those. BASF Total Petrochemicals, or BTP, is a 60-40 joint venture between BASF and Total. This includes a flexible feedstock steam cracker, downstream petrochemicals units, and refining assets. The company started as a limited partnership between BASF and Fina Oil and Chemical, who were eventually acquired by Total. At one point in its history, what is now BTP included a tri-venture called Sabina, which had Shell as a partner. Next door to BTP in Port Arthur is the ethane cracker of Bayport Polymers, or Baystar. This is a 50-50 joint venture between Total and Borealis and includes polyethylene assets. The company was founded as a 50-50 joint venture between Total and Novialis, with Novialis being a 50-50 joint venture between Nova Chemicals and Borealis. In 2019, Nova sold its shares to Borealis. And by the way, Borealis is a 64-36 joint venture between Mubadala Group and OMV. Braskem Idesa was formed in 2010 as a 75-25 joint venture between Braskem of Brazil and Idesa of Mexico. The joint venture was formed to build a petrochemicals complex capable of supplying polyethylene to the Mexican market. Braskem Idesa began producing polyethylene in 2016 and now produces more than 800,000 tons annually. Chevron Phillips Chemical, or CPChem, was founded in 2000 as a joint venture between Chevron and Phillips 66. They have a number of petrochemicals facilities in Texas and one in Mississippi, as well as in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. A year after forming their joint venture, CPChem formed a joint venture with Qatar Petroleum called QChem. Ethylene 3, or E3, is a 50-50 joint venture between Nova Chemical and Dow Chemical, which was recently in the headlines after an Alberta court awarded Nova to pay 1.43 billion Canadian dollars, or just over $1 billion US dollars, to Dow due to contract violations related to Dow receiving less than its share of ethylene. Nova's cracker in Geismar, Louisiana is also a joint venture, with Nova owning 88.46% and SABIC owning the remaining 11.54%. Gulf Coast Ventures is a 50-50 joint venture between ExxonMobil and SABIC. They plan to build an ethane cracker, 2 polyethylene units, and a monoethylene glycol unit in Texas. This is the third joint venture between Exxon and SABIC and the first outside of Saudi Arabia. Their first joint venture in petrochemicals started 35 years ago, which is an example of a successful international relationship. The Lotte Axial Chemical Corporation, or LACC, finalized their joint venture agreements in 2015. The agreements included spending about $3 billion on an ethane cracker and ethylene glycol plant in Louisiana. In 2016, Westlake purchased Axial, thus securing just less than 12% share of LACC. At the end of 2019, Westlake increased its ownership stake in LACC to 46.77%. Technically, the joint venture is between Lotte Chemical USA and Eagle US, which is a subsidiary of Westlake Chemical Corporation. And finally, OxyChem Marychem is a 50-50 joint venture between Occidental Chemical Corporation and Mexichem. The joint venture was formed in 2017 to build an ethylene cracker in Texas, which would ultimately supply Marychem's polyvinyl chloride business. The cracker came online in 2017. So as you can see, joint ventures play a major role in North American petrochemicals. So let's turn our attention to Peter Daniel. He is a Senior Managing Director at Water Street Partners and an expert in joint ventures. Peter joined the company in 2010 and was elected partner in 2015. Over the past decade, Peter supported over 100 clients across all phases of the partnership lifecycle, including deal negotiation and structuring, implementation, and ongoing management and governance. He has worked with clients in North America, Europe, and the Middle East, focusing on manufacturing, technology, and healthcare. As a recognized expert in joint ventures and alliances and governance, Peter has presented partnership strategy and execution to over 50 executive management teams and over 20 boards of directors. Peter earned a Bachelor of Science degree in International Economics from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Services. Let's welcome Peter. Well, Peter, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Oh, Robert, it's my pleasure. Thanks for giving me the chance.
Well, first off, tell me a little bit about Water Street Partners. What's your mission and vision, and who do you serve?
Yeah, happy to. So, as you know, negotiating and structuring a joint venture, it's different than doing M&A. And running a joint venture, either as a member of JV management or as a member of the JV's board of directors, it's just different than running a similarly sized, wholly owned business. We think if you apply an M&A mindset to a JV transaction, or if you approach JV management or governance as if it's a normal, right, management or board role, then you're likely to fail, unfortunately, or at least be deeply uncomfortable. So we exist to do two things, right? On the deal side, we help transaction leaders address unique challenges that joint ventures and alliances introduce, from selecting the right deal option, to selecting the right partner, to negotiating and structuring something that can stand the test of time. And with existing JVs, Robert, we help management teams and boards when frictions around the joint venture strategy or its organizational model or its services model, all, for example, threaten the JV's performance. In our experience, I'm sure in yours, you're a deep JV expert, I know that, with decades of experience, too many JVs get stuck. The governance is specifically designed that way, right? In bilateral shared control joint ventures, all the important decisions need to be unanimous. And you just think about that. How many partnerships have you been in where you always agree on all of the important stuff with your partner? It's just not going to happen. So we get called in to assess how the JV is working and to get the partners, who at that point probably have differing interests, aligned on change. We've been doing this as Water Street since 2008, but as of 6 weeks ago, we're now doing it as Ankura Consulting. And we're only 6 weeks in, but we're incredibly excited about the capabilities Ankura brings to bear in client situations. On the deal front, they bring deep valuation, financial accounting, due diligence, expertise. With existing JVs, we're going to be able to tap into their world-class human capital, change management, turnaround and restructuring services as well. So a bit of news after 12, 13 years for Water Street that we're excited about.
Yeah, that is exciting change. You mentioned something I want to come back to and ask you about. I think formation of a joint venture is really pretty important. And what are the key decisions that the partners need to make up front that'll increase the success of the business?
Yeah, great question. So I think of it in at least two ways, Robert. First, I think about it as it relates to the process related decisions. For example, what's the logic behind the deal? Do we have the right potential partner? Are we aligned on what the best deal option is, right? What should this thing look like? Should it be thick? Should it be thin? Should it be populated? Should it be virtual? What should it do, right? Should it grow, or should it fit narrowly and forever between the businesses of the parent companies? And then lastly, on process, where are we willing to flex on terms? And what are our walkaway positions? So I make that distinction between process and what I'll talk about in just a moment, which is specific to key deal terms, because those questions, those answers, they're in your control, right? You can decide those things without the partner. Whereas the next set of things, the second way that I tend to look at this is through the lens of key deal terms. And I'll start by saying, Robert, you cannot win on all terms. So this is different than M&A. And also, the answers to these questions, they aren't totally in your control. So you need a willing partner to do the hard work of agreeing on the following things. So first, are we aligned on desired level of ownership? And do we agree that the valuation of our respective contributions gets us to that level? Second, can we design a governance system and a decision-making process that reduces the chances of friction, right? So reduces the chances of dispute, ultimately reduces the chances of deadlock. Can we scope the position, to my point of a moment ago, in a way that allows it to succeed without stepping on parent company toes? If you're stepping on your parent company's toes, you're likely to get whacked, right? And that's going to keep you from success in most cases. Will the JV have people in it? And where do those people come from, right? Are they independent, or do they come from the owners? And what do they do, right? Even who do they report to? That can be really important. Fifth, what services, what systems, what technology will the JV do or own versus source from its parents or other third parties? And if it's sourcing from parents or third parties, what are those agreements? How are they structured? Who's making money on that? And then lastly, an important one, how do we deal with exit, right? Especially when one partner is likely to be the more natural buyer of the business. So I know that was a lot. Please fire away with questions. Let me know if it made sense.
Well, yeah, it does. And it kind of leads into my next question really nicely. I was looking around on your website and I found some interesting research, and it basically said that a joint venture formed in the latter half of the 1990s had double the lifespan of a joint venture formed a decade before. So why is that?
Yeah, thanks for finding that research. We did it 5 or 10 years ago, I think. We've actually updated it fairly recently, and I can get the updated version over to you. But let me first just start by saying we took a random sample of 600 joint ventures announced between 1985 and 2000, and we just studied what happened to them. And one of the findings is that lifespans are increasing. So joint ventures formed in the late 90s, they tended to last longer than joint ventures formed in the late 80s, for example. And there are a few reasons for this, really related to the kinds of joint ventures in the sample set. So first, the number of JVs established in Asia increased about 3x between the late 1980s and the late 1990s. JVs in Asia, they just tend to last longer because they tend to take more time and money to set up. Also, it's important to note that Western partners, they're just much more unlikely to terminate if the joint venture is the only path to doing business in the country. So take China, for example. That was the case in most industries for a long while. You terminate your China joint venture, you may have to exit the country, right? Which everybody knew would be a huge market, on its way to number two, obviously eventually on its way to number one. So that's one reason. The other reason is the number of assets joint ventures increased by about 2x between the late 80s and the late 90s. And what I mean by an asset joint venture is one whose purpose is to develop, build, operate an asset. It could be a power plant, could be an oil field, could be a mine, right? These kinds of joint ventures, they just have longer lifespans. Those lifespans actually often mirror the lifespan of the underlying asset. So, it doesn't make sense really to exit an oil field when the oil is still flowing and you're recouping the significant investment you and your partner made up front. So those are a couple of the reasons related to what kinds of joint ventures are in that data set. I think it's important for me to close by saying, we think it may also be increasing because companies are getting better at putting together joint ventures and overseeing joint ventures. They're doing more good deals in our experience. They're doing less bad ones, right? Like it's no longer common for folks in a business unit to be able to put together a joint venture and then kind of tell corporate later that, guess what? We've got this new joint venture. Isn't this exciting? And corporate would look at it and say, boy, I wish you had told me earlier, I would have killed that deal, right? It doesn't fit with our strategy, what have you. So that's on the transaction side. On the governance side, I think they're just working harder to ensure their existing JVs aren't getting stuck. Just as a simple example, the number of companies that train their JV board directors, that has increased significantly over the past 10 or 15 years. Now more than half of companies with JV portfolios provide training to their JV board directors. You'd be kind of crazy not to, but believe it or not, you go back a couple decades and that was a rare thing.
It's very interesting. There are joint ventures across various industries, and clearly you're talking to a company called Petrochemical Strategies. So I'd like to know what is different about petrochemicals joint ventures than, joint ventures in other industries.
Yeah, let me start with the obvious. There are a lot more joint ventures in oil and gas and petrochemicals than in other industries. Take Shell, for example. Shell has nearly 1,000 joint ventures. You could probably add up all of the joint ventures across all of the technology industry and not get close to 1,000, right? So just the sheer volume and importance of JVs in oil and gas and petrochemicals sets those industries apart. So across 2019, the industry, no surprise to you, it continued to pursue large production asset joint ventures. For example, Qatar Petroleum and CP Chemicals, they announced their intention to pursue JVs to build combined ethylene crackers and HDPE units in both Qatar and Texas, actually. This is like a combined investment of $10 billion. Lyondell and Bora just signed definitive agreements for a 50-50 JV to operate an ethylene cracker and polyolefins derivative unit in China. These are massive, right? And it makes sense to share risk and also to have a local partner who can give the JV freedom to operate. So in Qatar, that's Qatar Petroleum, a good partner to have, Bora in China, and then CP Chemicals reciprocating here in the US, being a steward of Qatar Petroleum's operations here in the States. So beyond partnering to share risk, to get help from local partners, something that petrochemical companies have been doing for decades and tend to be pretty good at, we're seeing a number of partnerships in the circular economy. In fact, a recent analysis by a colleague of mine named Josh Kwasinski showed a 200% increase from 2018 to 2019. Let me just share some new partnerships that are in this space, including LG Chemical and ADM to develop bio-based acrylic acid from corn, BASF, company you know well, and Quantafuel working together to develop pyrolysis technology. And Amsty, right in your neck of the woods, Robert, they're headquartered in the Woodlands. They're partnering with Agilix to convert post-consumer polystyrene packaging into styrene monomer. We're really excited about this stuff, not only because it's great for the environment, because we think it's going to give chemical companies the freedom to operate, kind of continue to do what they do, making plastics, for example, for a longer period of time. But we know that they're going to be pretty hard, right? Chemical companies' playbooks for partnering, they're going to need to change because these circular economy partnerships, they just took totally different from what they're used to. You're not partnering with another chemical company, right? It's not QP and CP Chemicals. It's, theoretically CP Chemicals with some small startup in the technology space that hasn't even ever produced a product yet, right? Like think about the two cultures there and what you need to do differently to make that kind of partnership work.
All right, finally, Peter, I have to ask you one question because you've been able to look a little bit behind the curtain a bit
Yeah.
on some things, and without disclosing any proprietary information, I'm wondering if you can share a story of a joint venture horror story, basically a how not to do this type story.
um, that's a really interesting question. I'll probably play it safe, Robert, if that's okay, and talk about some that are in the public domain. So your listeners probably care most about examples from the natural resources industry. So let's start there with Buncefield. So Buncefield is a 60-40 joint venture between Total and Texaco. It suffered a depot explosion in the UK. It took days just to put the fire out, right? And ultimately, Total was deemed to be the operator of the JV, even though they only own 60%. So far from having full control from an equity perspective. And they were held liable for the incident, paying about $1 billion in damages. A more recent example is E3, a 50-50 JV between Nova and Dow. Despite being 50-50, Nova operated it because it was on a Nova site. And after many years of working together, Dow alleged breach of contract related to how ethylene flowed between the JV and Nova's wholly owned plants on that site. And another one, years of litigation, but Dow was fairly recently awarded over $1 billion in damages from Nova. So, those are examples of when things go wrong and just how costly they can be. I think those kinds of incidents honestly can be surprises to boards of directors who say, man, I didn't even know we were in a joint venture with Dow on, this property. Why did we do that? Right. And how could we have been doing it wrongly? Or at least in the eyes of the court. So those are really negative surprises for companies. One that we all kind of know about, maybe if we shift outside of natural resources, is the joint venture called Hulu. You might be a subscriber to it. The JV was founded in 2006 and is now owned by Walt Disney and Comcast. Past owners included 21st Century Fox, Time Warner, the private equity firm Providence Equity Partners. It was a great idea back in 2016 to bring digital content directly into homes via the internet, right? It's even a better idea today, I would argue, with fast internet speeds, with hundreds of millions of Americans stuck more or less at home because of COVID. But, I think the partners found it incredibly difficult to work together, given that they competed everywhere but Hulu, right? And also to share control of a service that each year becomes more important as companies cut the cable cord, right? These kinds of services are going to be more important than maybe even people could have guessed back in 2006. And I think there's just a natural desire to own the things, to control the things that are most important to your business, right? So Disney went its own way with Disney Plus, which despite being less than a year old, has about 25 million more subscribers than Hulu. So think about that. Hulu's almost 15 years old. So just the muscle that Disney put into its own services versus the one it held in joint ventures kind of tells a story. Comcast went its own way with Peacock. So despite literally billions and billions of dollars invested in Hulu over the last 15 or so years, there are rumors that Disney may choose to shelve it once it buys Comcast out, which it agreed to do last year, kind of as part of the deal they did with 21st Century Fox, right? That very big acquisition. So I like that story because it's one of the few joint ventures that is in the consumer space. People know it. They may not know it's a joint venture, but we all have seen the advertisements for Hulu and can probably appreciate, wow, okay, I didn't know it was competitors trying to figure out a way to make that business work.
Yeah, Peter, that is a very interesting story. And I think we can talk for hours about joint ventures and the trials and tribulations of being in one. And it'd be a very interesting conversation. But I want to thank you today for sharing your insights and really appreciate everything you shared with us today. And I hope you and your family are safe.
Yeah, Robert, thanks so much. Great to see you. Hope if I'm down there in Houston in the near term, we get to, I don't know, either have a beer or go for a run. I think we'd enjoy doing either. But yeah, have a great rest of your day. Thanks for the chance.
So what do we learn? Joint ventures can be sticky, they can be troublesome, just like the joint venture between Pat and Chris in episode 1. But if they're done correctly, they can be very beneficial to the partners. Peter did an excellent job of outlining what some of those criteria would be or some of the factors necessary to set up a successful joint venture. So I thank him for that. Thank you for watching today at Petrochemical Strategies. A full transcript and references can be found on my website, petrochemicalstrategies.com. I will see you next time.